Our speaker today, Professor Eric Klein, almost needs no introduction. Dr. Klein is both an archaeologist and ancient historian by training, specializing in biblical archaeology, the military history of the Mediterranean world from antiquity to the present, and international connections in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East during the Late Bronze Age. He's Professor of Classics and Anthropology and Director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute at George Washington University, and is former chair of the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations there. A National Geographic explorer, a Fulbright and Getty scholar, and an NEH public scholar, with degrees from Dartmouth, Yale, and the University of Pennsylvania. He's an active field archaeologist with more than 30 seasons of excavation and survey experience in Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, Crete, and the US, including 10 seasons over a 20-year period from 1994 to 2014 at the site of Megiddo, the biblical Armageddon, of course, in Israel. And he's currently co-director of the renewed series of archaeological excavations at the site of Tel Kabri in Israel. He's also an award-winning teacher and author, and a 3-time winner of the Biblical Archaeological Society's Best Popular Book on Archaeology. He's published 20 books, which have been translated into 19 different languages, and was considered for a Pulitzer Prize for his recent book, 1177 BC. Dr. Klein's video lecture on 1177 BC has now had more than 5 million views. He's appeared in numerous television documentaries broadcast by the National Geographic Channel, the Discovery Channel, the BBC, PBS, and the History Channel. Dr. Klein is talking to us today on the history of archaeology at Megiddo, particularly the University of Chicago excavations there in the 1920s and 30s, drawing on archival records to present the world of biblical archaeology nearly 100 years ago. His most recently published book, Digging Up Armageddon, The Search for the Lost City of Solomon, explores this topic in depth, setting the expedition against the backdrop of the Great Depression in America and the growing troubles and tensions in British Mandate Palestine. I am pleased to announce that we've negotiated a 40% discount from the listed price from the publisher Princeton University Press for those members, I repeat members, who would like to contact our administrator Sheila Ford after the lecture. So, without further ado, please welcome Professor Eric Klein.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And it is an absolute delight and honor to be here today. I thank you for the invitation, and I thank all of you for showing up. Now, if things have worked, you should be able to see the first slide of my presentation. If someone can give me a thumbs up and acknowledge that, that would be great. Yes, perfect. Okay, yes. Great, thank you. Okay, then without further ado, let me get started. I have so many stories and so little time, so you will forgive me if I go through fairly fast. But we're going to be concentrating today on Megiddo, and I show you here a slightly blurry picture from its early days before any excavation. This is from about 1902. And to put it in context, Megiddo, if you haven't been there, is in the Jezreel Valley in the north of Israel. It's actually on a major crossroads. The Via Maris, the way over the sea, comes up running north-south, but there's also an east-west highway that goes down through or across the valley of Jezreel. So to put it in even larger context, that means that in the ancient world, if you wanted to go from north to south or south to north or east to west, in other words, if you wanted to get from Egypt up to Anatolia or over to Mesopotamia, you had to pretty much come right by Megiddo. And so, in fact, Tutmosis III, the Egyptian pharaoh who fought the first battle that we know of in history, we say that because he wrote it down, when he fought the battle at Megiddo and won back in the 15th century BCE, he said that the capturing of Megiddo is like the capturing of 1,000 cities, and he wasn't far wrong. So there have been something like 34 battles fought either at Megiddo or nearby over the last 4,000 years. with everyone that you see on the screen having fought there. Tutmosis III, and then some of the biblical characters, Deborah and Barak, Jonathan, Saul, even Josiah as well. Crusaders, Mamelukes, Mongols, Romans, Napoleon, and then my favorite man with a feather in his hat, Lord Allenby in World War I. So lots of people have fought there. And in fact, most people don't even realize, but Megiddo is Armageddon. Armageddon is a real place. The name Armageddon, which is used in Revelation 16:16 in the New Testament, says that they gather the kings together in the place that in Hebrew is called Armageddon. And the name actually comes from Har Megiddo, Hebrew for the mound or mountain of Megiddo. And over the years, the aspirant at the beginning, the H was dropped off and the N was added on. So Har Megiddo became our Armageddon. So I want to take you through some of the things that happened there, but to lead into it, first of all, here is another picture from its early days. Megiddo is about 110 feet tall, which I think would translate to what, somewhere between 30 and 35 meters tall. It contains 20 cities, one on top of another in that mound. They date back to 5000 BCE and come as close to us as about 350 BCE. That means by the time that Alexander the Great came through, the mound had been abandoned, but not the region. The Romans, for example, we know lived next to it. There's a big Roman legionnaires camp right next to it. And then there are other ancient villages nearby as well. But they've moved off the mound in about 350 for unknown reasons. I suspect the water temporarily gave out, but I can't prove that. So we're basically looking at 20 cities, 5,000 years of history from the Neolithic period down through the Persian period. And for those of you that want a stratigraphic overview, here is a table that David Ushishkin published in 2018, and you can see the Megiddo strata according to the Chicago numbering system in this second column, with 20 at the very bottom and 1 at the very top. So you can see we're going from Neolithic through Persian. So Megiddo is famous for a number of different discoveries, some of which we will cover today briefly. You've got the stables on the top left, water tunnel top right, some of the Megiddo ivories, and then a small seal, which is now missing, by the way. If anybody ever finds it, please let me know, on which it says Shema, servant of Jeroboam. So to start at the beginning, very quickly, this is Gottlieb Schumacher. He's the first person that excavates at Megiddo. He was there from 1903 to 1905. He is of German origin, but he's actually American. He's born in Zanesville, Ohio. His father moved the family to Haifa when Gottlieb was about 7 years old, and his father, Jacob, was one of the city planners for Haifa. So when you look at the old city of Haifa, it was Schumacher's father who laid that out. So Gottlieb eventually trained as an architect and an archaeologist. These are pictures of his camp at Megiddo in those early years. He is best known for the Great Trench that he put right through the entire mound. You can see it on the right-hand plan running north to south across the entire mound. Now, this is the same thing that Heinrich Schliemann did at Troy about 35 years earlier. Schliemann started at Troy in about 1870 and did the same thing, put a whacking great trench right through the mound of Troy using hundreds of workmen. So Schumacher did the same thing. He fortunately was a very good draftsman, but these are the early days of archaeology. So what he found or didn't find, one must take now with a grain of salt and compare it to what the later archaeologists and expeditions have found. So He was there from 1903 to 1905. The mound then lay fallow, as it were, with nobody digging there until after World War I, when Chicago began digging there. And in fact, Lord Allenby, who you see again on the right here, who fought a battle at Megiddo in 1918, which mimicked Thutmose III's tactics 3,400 years later, with the same victorious result. Allenby met up with Breasted after the war, and he was the one that suggested that Breasted should begin excavating at Megiddo. Now, Breasted had just founded the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago. In fact, they are celebrating their centennial right now. And Breasted was looking for a place to dig. In fact, they ended up digging at 4 or 5 different places, but Megiddo was one of them. And Breasted was specifically looking for King Solomon and Thutmose III, trying to figure out which city Thutmose had conquered and which city Solomon had built, which the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, says that Solomon built at Megiddo. And they managed to get funding from the man in the middle here, John D. Rockefeller Jr. He agreed to fund the first 5 years, gave them $215,000, which doesn't sound like an awful lot until you convert it into today's money, and it is the equivalent of $2 million, which is pretty good for the first 5 years. So Chicago, which is what we will concentrate on here, Chicago was there from 1925 until 1939. And you see here Breasted on the left, and then the 3 successive field directors, Clarence Fisher, PLO Guy, and Gordon Loud. This is showing the areas that they excavated. Basically, they were responsible for most of the excavation or damage done to the mound, as it were. And a lot of our information is going to come from them. Now, they were very innovative. Among other things, they were one of the first excavations in the Middle East to use balloon photography. And you see here some of the early pictures of them sending up their balloons. It was a rubber balloon from the United States, but was filled with gas that they had to import from Marseille. So they sometimes were not able to take pictures until they got more gas. But as a result, they were able to take photo mosaics of the entire mound. And you see here one of the aerial photographs that they made. There were, I believe, 2 of these mosaics made. One is still at the Oriental Institute in Chicago today. I think the other one has disappeared, but somebody may be able to correct me. And this photo mosaic looks better in colorized, and you can see Schumacher's trench going right across the mound there. They also were among the first, actually I think they might have been the first, to use a Munsell color chart. And those of you who have excavated know that this is how we describe the color of the soil that we are excavating. And Breasted was told this about by the art department at the University of Chicago, who said, everyone's using it in the art departments, maybe you should try it on the excavation. And so Breasted, shipped a couple copies over in 1929 or so, which was the year after it was first published. And then they did something that I haven't seen at many other excavations. Namely, about halfway through, Breasted instructed them to start using a code book for their telegrams that they were sending back and forth, because he didn't want the telegraph operators to know what they were finding. And you can see in the middle here, one of these coded cables that is now in the archives of the Oriental Institute. He did notice and mention to the excavators, he actually sent copies to all of the Chicago excavations, and he complained that Bentley had not included code words specifically for archaeology. So there were blank pages at the back where they could put in the ones that they had created. So Chicago then, as I said, was there until 1939. They stopped because of World War II, as we'll see at the end. And that left the way for the next 2 excavations to come in, namely Yigal Yadin, you see here on the left, He was there for a couple of seasons in the 60s and 70s. And then the Tel Aviv Consortium came for a first season of exploration in 1992, and then began full tilt every other year, 1994 onwards. They are still excavating. And you see here two of the three co-directors, Israel Finkelstein on the right, David Yushishkin on the left, and in between, Norma Franklin, who is here with us today, and who knows more about Megiddo than anybody alive today, myself included. And I'm very indebted to her for a lot of what I was able to put into the book. Now, I personally was there from 1994 until 2014, started as a volunteer, worked my way up to being co-director before I had to retire when I was appointed co-director of Basor, and was digging also at Cabri. But these were 20 wonderful years, 10 seasons of excavation, and at some point we brought the whole family. You can see my lovely wife Diane here, and our daughter Hannah, who came to dig when she was 18 months old, and my trowel is almost bigger than she was at the time. She's, by the way, now 26 and teaching fourth grade in Bethesda. So in the interim then, after I retired from the excavation, I decided I wanted to write a book about the excavations, but David Yushishkin I knew was writing one, and it came out in 2018. You can see it here on the left. It's on the archaeology and the stratigraphy. It's absolutely wonderful. I highly recommend it. And so I didn't want to mimic a book like he did, and hence my book, which you see on the right here, takes a slightly different turn and focuses as much or more on the archaeologists, that is the people, as it does on the archaeology. And one of the reasons that I did this was that when I went to the Oriental Institute at Chicago and I went into their archives, I found things that I was not expecting. I thought that there would just be photographs and dig diaries and things like that. What I found was all the cables that went back and forth, the personal letters that were going back and forth, and all the various, I would say, almost detritus of an excavation that you don't usually see. In other words, I had the paperwork, many of which said on them, please do not show this to anybody else, but sorry, too late. And so I've got now the inner workings and the dirt on everybody, if you pardon the pun. So I decided to make this the focus and to look at what was happening there. In other words, to tell the stories behind the stories. And then it was pointed out to me, I think it was Aran Aryeh that told me this, that the Israel Antiquities Authority had just put most of their British Mandate archival records online, and they were freely accessible, and indeed they were, so I got all of those as well. And then I took a trip to Sleepy Hollow, New York, which some of you may know as the home of the Headless Horseman, but it's also the home of the Rockefeller archives, and there I found quite a bit of the correspondence between John D. Rockefeller Jr. and the Megiddo people. And so between them all, then, I was able to reconstruct the stories, as I said, behind the stories. And what really, to me, came to life, all these people had really just been names. They had been names to me on the cover pages of the books and in footnotes. Now they became real people. We ended up, I have to apologize to my wife, because we ended up living with these people in our house for a good 5 years as I was reading the book. So Ed Deloche and Stanley Fisher, Higgins, Kellogg, Ruby Woodley, Bob Engberg and Bob Lamont, Olaf Lind, the photographer, all of these people came to life. And I give you just a couple of examples, and I'm indebted to Jackie Shipton Gooder here, who sent me Harry Parker's photo album. You can see Harry Parker circled on the left there. Harry's actually real name is Ralph. He was 28 years old when he came over to Megiddo, decorated Army vet, and had been a police officer in British Mandate Palestine before he joined the staff at Megiddo. He became PLO Guy. You see him here in the middle with the puppy. He became Guy's right-hand man and was at Megiddo longer than anybody else. He actually oversaw the property right up until 1954. And you see in the bottom right there his part of his military papers. Some of the others I have circled here on the far right. You see Jeffrey Shipton, Jackie and Liz's father, who are both here today, and I welcome them. Jeffrey co-authored the Megiddo 1 volume, which is the final report on the first 10 seasons. And he came to Megiddo when he was 17. He's actually Harry Parker's cousin. And then next to him, also circled, is Bob Lamont. He was the co-author with Shipton on the Megiddo 1 volume. And he also wrote the volume on the Megiddo water tunnel. Now, when he came to Megiddo, he was 22 years old. He was a frat boy. He was in Beta Theta Pi, majoring in geology, taking a break from college. He eventually finished his degree via correspondence and one more semester back at Chicago. And what I find amazing is that between the two of them, Shipton and Lamont wrote or co-authored 5 out of the final publications, which is the same number as the 3 field directors combined, which I find absolutely amazing. So young, but very, very talented. I also was able to find out other things I had no idea about. For example, Ed Deloche, another young Chicago graduate, got married at Megiddo while he was there. Most of the people came to the wedding, not the guys. They boycotted it. And then, courtesy of Harry Parker's photo album, these just recently were digitized, and I took the liberty of actually colorizing them. I hope people don't mind, but for me, it brought it to life. And so now we're able to see some of the luncheons and dinner parties with Fisher and PLO Guy and others seen in here. And then down here, Sir William Matthew Flinders Petrie peeking out of the car, and his wife, Lady Hilda Petrie, who came up to visit in 1935. And we even have Christmas party pictures, before and after. Before is on the left and after is on the right. And I've been having fun working with some of the other descendants, including Bill and Ruth Staples' grandson, trying to figure out who these people are, because they are unlabeled in the copies that we've got. I think we've managed to identify almost all of them now. And then we're also able to begin reconstructing what I'm calling the invisible excavators at Megiddo. This is actually a project I'm working on right now. The local workmen and the Guftis are almost never mentioned by name in any of the final reports, but they are listed on requests made to the British Mandate government for half-price railway tickets back and forth to Egypt for the Guftis as they come up each year. We have far less mention for the local workmen that are coming from the villages around Megiddo, like Lejeune, but I'm trying to now reconstruct them as well as kind of an addendum to the book. And we do have some pictures of these Guftis and local workmen, so I'm able to now reconstruct Ali, as they called him, the potmender. Potmender, we would call him a conservator today. He was there for 14 of the seasons, and other people as well, including someone who was helping Olaf Lind, Salama, and Abu Yusuf, who was the rod man holding the stadia rod while they did the measurements. So the other thing that I discovered while I was doing this research was, even though I thought that I knew a lot about Megiddo, I realized that there was even more that I didn't know, including the gossip and the dirt about what was going on. So what I propose to do for the rest of my time here is in some ways test your knowledge, because a lot of the people that are here today know Megiddo extremely well. So what I'm going to do is present to you 10 facts that I did not know, and we'll see how many you didn't know, or maybe you did know, and go from there and walk through the history of these excavations via basically a top 10 list. So fact number one, of the three field directors, you see them all here, Fisher, Guy, and Loud, not a single one of them was trained as an archaeologist. That surprised me no end. They were, let's see, hold on, let me go back here. Fisher and Loud were architects, and Guy actually never finished for either college or law school. And he got into archaeology via being Woolley's photographer at Carchemish. Now, this isn't actually too surprising. Many of the early archaeologists were architects, in fact, but still, I had no idea that none of the three was originally trained. So Fisher was there from September 1925 until very suddenly he left. He was sacked in April 1927. Show you quickly the members of his first field excavation. Fisher brought his nephew, Stanley. They actually had the same name, Clarence Stanley Fisher, but the nephew went by Stanley. The cartographer, Daniel Higgins, his associate, that young man I mentioned, Ed Deloche. You will notice Ed Deloche in all the pictures because he has two-tone shoes. He was quite fashionable, I believe. And then John Payne Kellogg, who was Breasted's inside informant, and writes to him telling him of the goings on. The second thing that kind of astounded me, which I hadn't realized, but found when I went into the archives, that the excavations almost came to an end within 1 week of the very first season. We get this cable that Fisher sent back to Breasted. Higgins's attitude makes further association impossible. Dual direction always destructive of best results. Please accept my resignation. Now this must have come as some shock, and in fact Breasted writes back, this is a draft of the cable. Deeply regret trouble. Please understand you are sole director at Megiddo. There is no dual direction. And cabling Higgins right away. And Fisher then cabled this back. He actually cabled it from Jerusalem, where he had run away temporarily. And he says, thanks for the message. Rest assured, every effort will be made to ensure Megiddo's success. So they were able to sidestep that immediate problem. And indeed, Breasted did send a telegram to to Higgins. Work at Megiddo must be done under Fisher's sole instructions. Loyal cooperation with him indispensable. But things really still didn't work out. And by June of 1926, Breasted simply fired Higgins by sending him a cable. I guess it's kind of like being fired by tweet these days, but he got fired via cable. University will not require your services after July 31st. And that was it. Higgins was off the dig. So it got off to a rather rocky start, I might say. Now, fact number three, and I do realize and apologize for going through these quickly, but we do have 10 to get through. Fact number three, they had to live in tents while they were waiting for the dig house to be built. And you can see the tents that are set up here. And these pictures are courtesy in part of Carol Deloche Fletcher, who is Ed Deloche's daughter, and sent me these. But even though they had to live in tents, they did have 5 and 7 course meals, as well as afternoon tea. So this is a letter that Deloche wrote back to his mother. He said, the camp is very nicely fixed up. There are 6 tents, all very luxuriously furnished. Beds have white sheets, blankets, mosquito nets, fine woven grass rugs or carpets. We've got hot water. And then he says the meals are fine, better than at any of the hotels or on the boat that they took back and forth. Lunch is usually served in about 5 courses, and dinner in about 7 courses. And in the afternoon at 4, tea is served. So you see, he said, we are living in great style. And indeed, one of the staff members who came a couple of years later was absolutely appalled at the amount of time they spent having tea and eating lunch and dinner, and said, no wonder they don't get any work done around here. By that point, about 1930, 31, I think they were stopping for tea 3 times a day. So very civilized, but not much in terms of getting work done. The other thing that was causing a problem, and this is our fact number 4, that at one point the entire team was suffering from malaria. You can see a picture on the right there of the Jezreel Valley, which was still a swamp at that time in the mid 1920s. In fact, they ended up draining it with help from Rockefeller, who gave money for doing it. But when Chicago first got there and were living in the tents especially, they all came down with malaria one after another, so that the workmen up on top of the mound were excavating completely unsupervised. And there was one time, we know, when the British High Commissioner visited and said that not a single person was on top of the mound. They were all in their beds sick. And in fact, we've got a letter written by John Garstang, the director of the British School and of the Department of Antiquities at the time. He came to visit and afterwards sent a letter to Breasted back in Chicago. My dear Breasted, I've just returned from Megiddo after an adventurous ride. Fisher is ill, and at the time of our call, none of his staff was there. Higgins is in Beirut, having had malignant malaria. The other 2 are in Haifa. All have had malaria. I can't explain that. Fisher also has had malaria on and off. He's very run down. If he doesn't stop work, he will collapse. Now he must knock off or you will bury him. So they all had malaria, and that was very, very unexpected. So Breasted got a bit worried, and he actually came over himself in March 1926, which was just as they actually began excavating. The fall 1925 season was surveying and building the dig house. You can see the dig house on the left there with the expedition car parked in front. And so Breasted came over in March to see what was happening. And we've got this picture which has been blown up and labeled courtesy, I believe, of Norma, who sent this to me. And so we can see a number of the local workmen and some of the Guftis. And then we've got Breasted and son Charles Breasted and others as well. So it was at that time, this is when we get fact number 5. At that time, in March 1926, they showed Breasted the famous Shashank or Shishak fragment, which Schumacher's workmen had actually found in 1903 to 1905, but had missed it, and they had thrown it out on their back dirt pile. When the Chicago team came, they had their workmen gathering rocks to help build the dig house, which you see in the background on the right there. And you see Breasted looking at this fragment, a very large fragment that they brought down. You can actually see it better on the left there. One of the Guftis, these Egyptian workmen that Petrie and others had trained and were now working at Megiddo, one of the Egyptian workmen recognized that there were hieroglyphs on top of this stone fragment. And so when Breasted came, he looked at it and he identified it as Shashank, which many people would identify with Shishak in the Bible. What Breasted never revealed in any of the publications is that it had not been found just before he got there. He always gives that impression. It had actually been found 4 months earlier, back in November 1925. And we know this because of a letter that Higgins, the cartographer, wrote back to Luckenbill at Chicago in late May. And he said, of course, you've heard about the Shishak or Shashank stele. Breasted did not seem too pleased that it had been resting here since last November without him hearing about it. And indeed, in all the interviews and publications, Breasted never breathed a mention of that. Instead, he simply said, when I first got there in the spring of 26, Fisher informed me a fragment inscribed with Egyptian hieroglyphs had been brought down from the top of the mound. And then he went on to reminisce about being a lad in Sunday school in the country and reading 1 Kings 14, which mentions Shishak as attacking Jerusalem. So this was a big deal. It was mentioned in papers around the world, but nobody knew that it had actually been found within a month of them first being at Megiddo. Now, this would really neither be here nor there, except for the fact that since we have a wall relief from Egypt of Shashank's campaign in which he claims to have conquered Megiddo, that would mean that since we found this fragment at Megiddo itself, which is probably from a triumphal monument or maybe like a big gate, as Shirley Ben-Dor Evian has just suggested, if we knew the level that Schumacher had found that fragment, then we might know which city at Megiddo Shashank had captured, and therefore we might know which city Solomon had built or fortified. But since Schumacher missed it and it was in a back dirt pile, we cannot use this for anything like that. So here's the Megiddo team in fall 1926. We're able to identify all of the Chicago staff, but as was typical, all of the Guftis, you see here about 21 of them that were coming up from Egypt. None of them are named here. I'm having trouble identifying which ones are which, but am working on it. And we also don't have a name for the two young men in the front, though Norma has suggested that one of them may be Fisher's adopted son, Daoud, but we're still trying to ascertain that as well. But you can see Fisher and his nephew, and then Olaf the photographer, Ruby Woodley, and Ed Deloche. Note the two-tone shoes right there. And then Labib Sorial and William Gadd, who were both college graduates. In the meantime, the dig house was finished. You can see here pictures from its various years during the excavation. And we have some interior photographs, again, courtesy of Harry Parker's photo album, which, again, I've taken the liberty of colorizing to bring out just how amazing it was. And in fact, we are told in 1933 by Betty Murray, who came over to visit Megiddo with the Crowfoots and fellow student Kathleen Kenyon. They were excavating at Samaria at the time, and Betty wrote home to her mother saying it was worth going there just to see how an expedition can be conducted when money is no object. And I'm indebted to Felicity Cobbing for showing me this letter. It's in the archives of the Palestine Exploration Foundation. So if we move on then to Guy in his years, 1927 to 34, when he was appointed, it was very sudden. Breasted came over again, and in the space of just a couple of days, he fired Fisher, reassigned him is the better term. You see the letter on 19th of April on the left, and the very next day, 20th of April, he appointed Guy as the field director. Basically, if you were at Megiddo, you did not want to see Breasted show up on a visit because he fired somebody almost every time, sometimes with ill-foreseen ripple effects. So the hiring and firing was so sudden that the Guftis, when they came up from Egypt that season, they found to their surprise, they thought they would be working for Fisher, and instead they were going to be working for Guy. So Guy faced a rebellion almost immediately by the Guftis, they were demanding higher wages and other things like that. And you see a letter that Guy wrote. He simply let 6 of them go right away. And he, in fact, sent a letter the same day demanding that those 6 never work in Palestine again. In fact, at least 2 of them did continue to work. That would be Labib Soriel and William Gadd. They simply went over to Tel El Nasba and worked for William Bade for a while, and then Soriel eventually joined Fisher to dig at other excavations later. But so Guy started out on a bit of a rocky path, also just as Fisher had started his tenure there, but for different reasons, being rocky. Within a year, though, Guy had found what he thought were Solomon's stables. And in fact, he sent a cable back to Breasted, which said, believe have found Solomon's stables. Quite literally, you see it here on the left. That is the cable that Guy sent back. 1 Kings 9:15 to 19 and 10:26, stop. Stratum 4 apparently corresponds, stop. Believe have found Solomon's stables. I personally have always wanted to send a cable where I could say stop, but I've never had that opportunity. But when I saw this in the archives at the Oriental Institute, this was one of the first things I came across, and this was exciting beyond belief. Working in the archives, and I will admit this is the first time I had ever done archival research, it's absolutely fascinating. I love it to death now. It's like being on an excavation on a dig, except that you're digging through paper rather than digging through dirt. And it's the same sort of thing where there's one missing piece. When you finally find it, may complete the puzzle, or it may keep being missing, and you are simply frustrated. And others, when you find something, it will raise more questions than it answers. So on the left was Guy's cable to Breasted, and Breasted's cable back on the right. I love this one, considering that he had been waiting for something like 8 years to find Solomon and or Tutmosis III, and now he's been told they've found Solomon. His cable back is a single word: congratulations. I would say that is fairly restrained. And these are the portions from the Hebrew Bible that Guy was referring to. 1 Kings 10, Solomon and his chariot cities, and then the other one, 1 Kings 9, talking about Solomon building Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. Now, Breasted was a little less restrained when he wrote to Rockefeller, the man who had been funding the dig, right? Remember, the first 5 years to the tune of the equivalent of $2 million. And he said, I have now received full confirmation of the discovery of the stables of Solomon. So this is something that every dig director wants to be able to tell their major funder. But he also released at the same time a press release. And so the discovery was covered everywhere: New York Times, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which is where Stanley Fisher was from, and the news went around the world. And so now we have topographic maps that we can create. If you assign the stables to Stratum 4A, this is what they're going to look like. But we have 2 questions, most of which are still being debated today. Namely, number one, are they actually still stables, or are they actually stables? Having been a part of the team that was able to excavate portions of these stables from, I think it was 1998 to 2006, we were in Area L, and we had advice from Lord Michael Allenby, recently passed away, unfortunately, and Deborah Cantrell, lawyer, archaeologist, and raiser of Tennessee walking horses. And they both assured us, looking at what we had uncovered, that these were more than likely stables. And they pointed to the troughs and the standing stones. So I do think that these are stables, and there are some very good publications now that Deborah Cantrell put out with Israel Finkelstein that you can take a look at if you want. But the other question is to when they date. That is, are they really Solomon's? Much more debated, and you can see that they've now been suggested to be, well, maybe Solomon's, maybe Jeroboam the first, possibly Omri or Ahab, maybe Jeroboam the second. This is by no means agreed upon. I tend to lean towards the last of these, Jeroboam the second, though the dispute is still ongoing. Well, regardless, Rockefeller came over to see what they had found in 1929. This is called the Great Royal Visit, and you can see Breasted and Rockefeller in this picture, along with most of the members of the Rockefeller family that came over on what Breasted called the Great Royal Visit. Another picture here where you see actually PLO Guy lecturing to all of them. And we have a diary entry from JDR Jr.'s own diary, which I found in the Rockefeller archives and amused me no end. Friday, March 8th, left at 9 a.m., drove to the Oriental Institute of Chicago House of Megiddo, Mr. Guy in charge, saw excavation of Solomon's stables, left after lunch, over same new road to highway near Haifa, then back through Nazareth and on to Tiberias. That's it. That's the only mention we've got in his diary. It's less than half a page. It's about 2-3 centimeters in height. And that's the only mention that the man who had given the equivalent of $2 million made of what he saw at Megiddo. Not sure he was that impressed. Well, soon thereafter, the Megiddo team had another staff photo. And you can see again, they like dogs, but you can see now it's not PLO Guy holding it. There we have the two-tone shoes of Ed Deloche. There's Guy in the middle, and to his right, on your left, is Yemima Guy, his wife, who was the daughter of the man who basically invented modern Hebrew. So Guy himself was not Jewish, but he married into the upper levels of society, of Zionist society at the time. And this actually created some friction upon occasion with some of the other members of the staff and with some of the Guftis and the local workmen. So the team at this point started to reflect some of the tensions that were in British Mandate Palestine at the time. The other thing that came to my attention, fact number 6, the team had been paying rent to the local villagers in return for being allowed to dig at Megiddo. But in 1928, 1929, it was they learned they had been paying rent to the wrong people. And they actually should have been paying rent to an American who was living in England. Her dad had founded a utopian colony in Indiana that was named New Harmony. And she had been married to Lawrence Oliphant. Some of you may know him, the famous Scottish travel writer. They were married for 6 months before he suddenly died, but he had bought a portion of Megiddo decades earlier. So you see here on the left, and then on the right, the monument set up in the cemetery at New Harmony. Her name is Rosamond Dale Owen Oliphant Templeton, and she called herself formerly owner of Armageddon because in 1930, Chicago bought her portion for $3,500. And in fact, in 1903, the London Daily News had conducted an interview of her, and they asked her, "How much of Armageddon do you own, Mrs. Templeton?" And she replied, "About 1,200 acres, and it is the central and best part." So eventually, in 1930, as the New York Times reported, Chicago bought it from her for $3,500, which today is the equivalent of about $48,000 US. Now, this is about the same time they first started digging the famous water tunnel. You see it here in the first couple of weeks of excavation. And Guy sent a telegram back to Breasted announcing that they were digging this ancient water system. And we have some pictures of it from those days. This is actually the photograph I used on the cover of my book. And then you see some of the black and white pictures, including with the burial on the lower left and the cablegram that Guy sent back announcing the rest of what they had found and saying that he thought they had found an alcove with a guard still dead at his post. Now, this has now been kind of retracted. One of the more recent analyses suggests that this might actually have been a Middle Bronze Age burial that was disturbed when they dug the tunnel back in antiquity. But still, this is what it looked like back in the early 30s, and they had just re-upped the electrical grid at Megiddo at the time, and you can see an electric line there. They were able to not only put in lights, but fans, because the air was so foul down there that the workmen couldn't dig unless they put fans down there. Now, in those same years, they were also uncovering stratum 6A. That is the burnt city. You can see all the broken pottery and the skeletons that they found there, including burnt wooden posts still in situ. And at first, Herbert May, who was one of the people digging, he thought that they represented a siege by the Philistines, but then they quickly decided, no, it's probably an earthquake. And indeed, in our excavations at Megiddo in Area K, we came down upon the exact same destruction level, but having seen this wall, and for other reasons, I would actually agree with the Chicago excavators that 6A is probably destroyed by an earthquake rather than invaders. Now, it was very soon thereafter that Guy was suddenly fired, July 1934, because Herbert May, who I just mentioned as working on that level, he left Megiddo to head to a new job at Oberlin College. But on his way out of Haifa, they opened up his luggage and found that he had a number of pottery sherds and stone flakes that he had not declared. And so they arrested him and fined him for smuggling antiquities. And so you see on the left, the cable that that Guy sent back to Breasted, and then a letter on the right, which is now missing, which I would love to see, but it has gone missing. This has been left in its stead in the archives at Chicago, that Charles Breasted took this letter out, and it is somewhere else, but he described it as the most scurrilous letter this institute has ever received. And for that, then, because very simply, Guy had not stepped in to say that what May was taking home was essentially sherds from the discard pile. And he was bringing a study collection to Oberlin, where he, as I said, was about to start teaching. And all Guy had to do was say, look, it's a study collection, and he's been given permission to take these homes. But Guy did not do that. He did not back him up. And for that, he got fired. Breasted sent this letter at the end of August, firing Guy. 3 days later, he sent Robert Lamond a letter appointing him temporary field director. And with that, Guy departs the scene. So there's a study seasons then for 1934 and 35, which Lamond, remember, he was that 22-year-old kid that was starting back in 1928. We're now 6 or 7 years later. But this is when Lamond and Shipton put together the Megiddo 1 volume. And in doing so, they realized that Fisher and Guy had missed an entire layer and had left all of stratum 5B out of their sequence. So they had to scramble to reassign everything. They sent a cable back. Fisher material reveals serious stratigraphic error. And then in a letter, rather restrained, Lamond said, naturally, the situation is causing us considerable consternation, and we should very much appreciate your help and instructions in the matter. And one of the reasons why this is important is because that level, stratum 5B, that had basically been missed, has now been suggested by David Yushishkin in his book that this is the settlement of Solomon's time. I'm not sure I agree. I actually think the burnt city of 6a is just as likely to be it, but this is why it's very good that Shipton and Lamont figured out that Fisher and Guy had missed that level. And then we move finally, and don't worry, I'm wrapping up here, to the Loud years, 1935 to 39. Very, very, very small team, and only a couple holdovers, Jeffrey Shipton and Robert Lamont, and Harry Parker, but with a couple of new people. And Loud started a new technique. Rather than going horizontal as they had been, he went vertical and went down, 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 all the way to bedrock. This is why we know that there are 20 cities, one on top of another right there. And these become area AA, BB, and CC. And BB over here on the right, that's where they went all the way down to bedrock. They also found that that area BB looked to be as if it was the religious area throughout history at the mound, including a wonderful statue of maybe El or possibly Baal. But Breasted never heard about that because he died about a week before they found it. He had actually just been to Megiddo and elsewhere, was on his way back to New York, and died just a few days after reaching New York at the age of 70. So the excavations continued on, but here, fact number 9 out of our 10, and I'm going to take just a little bit of time here because I think this is fascinating, that the famous ivories from the treasury, as they called it, belonging to the late Bronze Age palace, they came very close to not actually being either excavated or discovered in the spring of 1937. And that's because at the end of the season in 1936, in May, they were ordered to terminate the dig and to liquidate the dig house and all of its contents because they had run out of money. The Rockefellers had canceled their grant after Breasted had died. And so the OI was in severe financial straits at the time. But even though they were ordered to start liquidating things, they couldn't do it because the Arab revolt had just begun and it was not a good time to do this. And then while they were waiting, they actually got saved at the last minute because 50 grand showed up and they could actually dig in 1936 and 37. So they went into the treasury, which you see here. It's by the gate of the city, late Bronze Age. We're talking late 13th, early 12th century BC, round about 1177 BC. There's the treasury on the left. And on the right are the 3 rooms that make this up. And this is an unpublished sketch that Loud made in which he showed the 3 subterranean rooms. And then in the back, they actually did, and this first time I've ever seen it, what we would call microgridding. They separated it out into like 1 meter by 1 meter squares, which is something that we frequently do when you're finding a lot of things, so that they could say where each of the ivories actually came through. So here are some of them that they found, and you can see one of the typical photographs that are usually published of the ivories. And then on the right is the pen case with Ramses III's cartouche on it, which is why we can date this to round about 1177 BC or thereabouts. And the ivories are now split between the Oriental Institute in Chicago and the Rockefeller Museum in East Jerusalem. And we've got in the archives then the lists that were of the objects that were sent down to Jerusalem. This is just a partial list. They found over 300 of these ivory pieces in the treasury. And Loud published this in 2 different places. And this is where I know we're running out of time, but I just want to take a moment because he missed something here. He really missed it. He talks about here, this is in the Megiddo 2 volume, which came out in 1948. He said it's a 3-room unit, and he thinks that the objects in there indicate it was a storage place for valuables. So we should consider this unit the palace treasury, that there were a large collection of carved ivories, which must have been on shelves at one point. And then he also published a book specifically on the ivories, which came out in about 1939 or so. And he said here that he thought that it was the Prince of Megiddo that was collecting ivories, and that this is what we're looking at is the collection. But notice here, and I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but he points out that the ivories, as they found them, were helter-skelter, that the most were in the western half of the back room, and that there was no clear-cut layer to which they belonged, and that various bits and pieces of the ivories were found in the different three rooms, but matched up. That is, you could mend them up. And he still said that there was probably ivory collectors, and that was the hobby of the prince, but that it was all confused. But if you actually look at what he had in the archives, he wrote as they were excavating. And he starts describing in this letter to John Wilson, who was now the head of the OI, he says, in addition to the ivory, follow me here, all helter-skelter with skeletons of a child and a young camel, plus another human skull and one more camel skull. Now, I'm reading this in the archives going, wait a minute, there's two camels in the treasury? What? And there's skeleton of a kid, maybe two children. I never saw that in the publications. And indeed, in his diary on that same day, he said, in that back room where there's so many ivory fragments, there's a strange burial. Camel's head and probably a complete camel, two human skulls, some human ribs. And the next day in the diary, he wrote again that there were two skeletons, one child and one camel, and two additional skulls, one human and one camel. And Marion Feldman, back in 2009, found this picture in the archives where you can see the animal skeleton, the camel, in situ. And so this kind of piqued my interest. And I'm like, wait, what's going on here? And in fact, there is another letter from a month later in which Loud says over here, I still can't account for the child and the camel skeletons unless they were caught in the act of thieving and paid the extreme penalty on the spot. So Loud thought that maybe the kids and the camels were stealing things from the treasury and had been put to death. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never heard of a camel thieving. And these are subterranean rooms. How does a camel get into the treasury? And bear in mind that this is also the palace that's destroyed at the end of the late Bronze Age. So none of this really added up. So as to what the treasury might actually be, there's actually no obvious access. There's no stairway. There's not even a ramp there. Loud wasn't sure how they got into it. The ivory objects are all topsy-turvy and broken up, and some of the pieces in one room mend up with some in another. There are fragments from more than one human skeleton. Most of the objects are at the back. There's one or more animal skeletons present. In short, it's not a prince who collected ivory. It's not a thieving camel. And Haskell and Tina Greenfield say it's not a camel, it's an equid. And it was deliberately buried, such as we see in other burials in the Levant. In short, the treasury, it's a tomb with multiple interments over time, and with the earliest burial pushed to the back, as so often happens. And there's actually a parallel at Comla del Loz, which isn't too far to the north. And Hockman had already pointed this out. Here is his publication of what he called the treasury at Comla del Loz from the same time period. And even though he called it a treasury, he said it's a built tomb. And Elizabeth Wagner Durand agreed with this. These are her pictures from 2012. And I have to give credit, the first time that any of this was brought to my attention was back in 2009 when I was reading Inbal Samet's master's thesis, and she cited this, and I went, wait, what? What's going on here? So I think that this is what the treasury at Megiddo is. It's a tomb, and Laud completely misinterpreted it. All right, final home stretch here, and I know I'm over time here, but when Laud came back in 1938, he had just gotten married to honor Merrill, and his granddaughters actually live here in Washington, D.C. I'm in touch with them as well. Here's a sketch plan from what he was doing in the spring of 1939. And it's at this time during these years that he found the famous circular altar. He actually found also a huge city wall from stratum 18, which he tore down. It's completely gone now. I'll never forgive him for that. And then here at the end of 1938, in his final report, he said that they had cleared all the way down to bedrock, all the way down to stratum 20. But that was the beginning of the end. So we've got a letter where they're leaving at the end of May 1939 from Laud, saying that they're going to sail on May 9th. But then very soon thereafter, Geoffrey Shipton sent a letter saying he had been offered a job at Spinney's, which is actually still a company that is found across the Middle East. He had been offered a job and he was going to go take it, but that he'd be happy to help out on Wednesdays and Sundays because he'd still be based in Haifa. But with that, they were too short. They didn't have enough staff. So Laud started casting about for other staff members, but they were unable to find any. And so regretfully, then they canceled the fall 1939 season. And unbeknownst to them, they never dug at Megiddo again. They did not resume excavations after World War II. All the team members had taken other jobs or were otherwise engaged. And I mean that literally. You see here a letter that Sergei Chub, the chauffeur, wrote to Laud saying that Geoffrey Shipton had gotten engaged. And then Harry wrote to Laud also saying that, in fact, Jeff had gotten married to Hester Wood. She was Jeff's age and a jolly nice girl. And so they then had 3 children, 2 of whom are here today. So they never came back. And fact number 9, 1948, the dig house was looted during and just after the Israeli War of Independence. And then the dig house was burnt down, a soldier supposedly trying to get rid of a wasp's nest and set fire to the whole dig house. And then subsequently, the dig car, which you see here on the right, was totaled up in Iraq when it ran into a truck after being sold to the British Army. And we've got letters documenting how much was lost in the dig house because they did have permission to come back and they were planning on it, but it never happened. So when the dig house was burnt down, an awful lot of things were destroyed. And then finally, our last fact, number 10, in 1955, they finally sold the dig house to the government of Israel, and Chicago renounced its rights to the site, and they sold it to the Israeli government for the price of $1. And that was why Yadin was able to come and excavate in the 60s and 70s, and then Tel Aviv was able to start the consortium in 1994. So a very rapid trip through the history of the excavations at Megiddo. I've gone long, and I thank you for your patience. And I thank you for being here.
Eric, thank you very much indeed. If you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then indeed we can see everybody. Many, many thanks. An absolutely fascinating lecture and a fascinating glimpse of times past. Thank you also to Geoffrey Shipton's daughter Jackie Shipton for the fabulous photos, and very nice to see you and your sister Liz here. I do wonder whether 100 years from now, future archaeologists are going to be poring over today's spiky emails and texts with the same intensity that we're doing. Perhaps one or two of us maybe there, who knows? I think we've still got time for a few questions, and I'm going to hand straight over to David Roll, who's asked a couple of very interesting questions, which if he would like to unmute himself, then he can ask you those directly. Dave, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yes, I should be on now, actually.
Yes, you are. Thank you.
I'll give them both a try. They're quite tricky ones. The first one really is about the stele. When you mentioned the fragment of Shashank at Megiddo, as I understand it, it was found just to the east side of 6000, Palace 6000. And I believe the depth of the trench that was excavated only went down to 5A4B. So if the fragment was in reuse from an earlier stratum, it would suggest that it predates Solomon by some considerable amount of time, which means he can't be Shashank.
These are things that you, among others, have been debating for years and years and years. Exactly part of the problem is that we can't actually figure out what level it went down to. Even that is hypothetical. And actually, Norma Franklin is better positioned than I to talk about this. Yes, it was found to the east of Palace 6000. We did try and put some trenches down to see if we could find more fragments of it, but it's beyond hope. We didn't find any more, unfortunately. And as I said, the actual depth is problematic. So, yeah, but yeah, it's an ongoing controversy, I suppose is the best way to put it.
Interesting. And the other question I had for you was more to do with Laud's work on the LB Palace, the late bronze Northern Palace, which he completely dismantled and destroyed. And I want to ask you whether you would have done the same thing. And in fact, would you do it now with the Assyrian palaces to get to the LB Palace that's probably buried underneath the Assyrian palaces to get that archive?
Oh, excellent questions, excellent questions. I personally will never forgive Laud for dismantling the late Bronze Age palace. The walls stood 3 meters high and they were painted in places. But he wanted to see what was below it, so he dismantled it, which David Yushishkin has said was just unforgivable. And I would completely agree with that because there really wasn't that much below it, unfortunately. What he should have done, and what I would love to do with the Neo-Assyrian palaces, is to do what like Amnon Ben Tor has done at Hatzor, which is to pick them up and move them to another area on the site or even off the site so that you don't lose them, but then you can dig below them. And in fact, I would love to do that. That was actually why I joined the Megiddo expedition in the first place. In 94 we had plans to go below the Neo-Assyrian palaces and get the other half of the late Bronze Age palace that Laud had left there. And I am sure that that's where the late Bronze Age archive is. We know Biridia, the governor or king of Megiddo, wrote to Amenhotep III and Akhenaten. There's 6 letters from Biridia in the Amarna archive. And the responses, I think, are in the other half of the palace. So when I went as a volunteer in 94, I brought my Akkadian textbooks. I was ready to translate the tablets as they came out of the ground. Little did I know, of course, had we found any tablets, they would never have let me anywhere near them, right? What's this kid from the States doing? Yeah, right. So, but as a result, subsequently, we were denied permission to go down further because the large bulk might collapse. And so they moved that area. It's now the step trench right down. They're finding great things. This is where the new tomb was found. That's just been published a year or so ago. But they're going to miss the palace. They've missed the palace by, a dozen meters or so. So anyway, if it were me and Rockefeller offered me $2 million more, and the Parks Authority would agree, the first thing I would do would be to move the Neo-Assyrian palace and then go below it. But I'm afraid that'll probably never happen.
That's a wonderful answer. Thank you, Eric.
Very good. Thank you, David. Now, Robert Deutsch says he has some new information about the seal. Would you like to say more about this and unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, Eric. Thank you very much for a very interesting lecture.
Good to see
You
you.
asked about the seal. Thanks.
Mhm.
You mentioned the seal of Shema, the Eved Yeravam, the servant of Yerovam. Do you know that Gottlieb Schumacher had a daughter which was living in the north of Israel? Her name was Nelly. And she wrote a small booklet about her father, and in which she mentions that the seal was sent to Turkey, to the Caliph Abdul Hamid II it was, and since then nobody saw it anymore. But she told, not in the book, but she told to the archaeologist Ariel Berman, who was in a visit to her. She was in an elderly house then, that the seal was deposited in the tomb of Hamid II, as it was other things from different parts of the empire. So this is a story which she said, she told, and I don't know if she had any interest not to tell the truth. In any case, it is a possibility to go after the records of the deposits in the tomb of this sultan, and to see the records. Maybe we can find a record about this seal. I talked with Jacques Yakar from Tel Aviv University, who is a Turkish archaeologist, and you know him. And he said that we need somebody who knows Arabic of this period and has access to this place. So you have a new challenge.
So thank you very much for this. That may be the final step that I'm missing, because I kept it short in the book itself, but I was working with a friend of mine, a scholar, a Turkish scholar who does archival research. He was able to go into the archives in Istanbul, and we tracked the seal from Megiddo to Beirut to Istanbul and into the collection of the Sultan, where it was displayed until the new museum was built. And they then transferred the Sultan's collection into the new archaeological museum. And at that point, the seal disappears and all references to it. So we were thinking maybe it had fallen out of the case, maybe somebody had stolen it at that point. But if what you suggest is correct, then it may be that we should indeed go back into the archives and see if we can find any mention that it was taken and put into his tomb, which would explain why it's not in the museum. So we know it made it to Istanbul and into the collection, and that's where we lose it. So if your informant is correct, that may be the missing final step. So thank you. I'll contact him, see if he can get back to the archives and take a look at anything that is dealing with the burial, and then see, maybe we can locate it. I rather doubt they'll let us exhume the body and see if the seal is in his coffin as a burial good. But if we can find archival letters to that extent, that'll be good. So thank you for that tidbit. I will indeed follow up on that. Thank you.
Welcome.
Absolutely fascinating. Well, indeed, there's a thought about exhumation, isn't there? So see where that one leads to. We're probably running to the end of our time. Is there anybody else that has a question on today's absolutely fascinating lecture? Rachel, I think, as well as you have two hands, one for approbation, I think, and one for a question.
Yes, yes, excellent lecture. Thank you very much. I mean, it was just a comment really, because one of your fun facts was the issue of the malaria that struck the dig team, and how it decimated their ability to work for a while, and they had to sort of do remedial work to alleviate the problem in terms of the environment they were working in. I just wanted to comment that exactly the same thing happened, of course, to Petrie down at Tel el when he was working there, because they had very swampy areas down there, and they had to basically clear drainage ditches and remove the problem. But there, I mean, they were very, they spent a lot of time trying to get the government to pay for it, and to no avail, and they had to actually fund it themselves. And you see in their publicity materials afterwards a lot of attempts to try and recoup the amount they had to spend clearing out these ditches from fundraising and so on. I'm not sure that they actually got very far with that, but I just wonder how much of a problem that was in other digs as well, because obviously the climate was not always very healthy in the areas that people had to work on these digs.
Yeah, good point. I hadn't realized that they had suffered elsewhere. I thought it was almost unique to the Jezreel Valley. But yeah, one of the things that I found, and I showed a quick picture of it when I was in the Rockefeller archives. I had been talking to one of the archivists and was talking to him about malaria. It was over lunch. And he's like, oh yeah, Rockefeller helped pay for getting rid of it. We've got maps. Do you want to see the maps?
Oh,
and
wow.
he took me, we literally got in an elevator and went 6 floors below ground level into this vaulted area with, air conditioning and this and that. And he pulled out these huge maps, and I was able to stand on a chair to take a picture. But it was a map of all the areas in British Mandate Palestine that suffered from malaria, to which the Rockefeller money had contributed to helping to get rid of it. So I'll send you a copy of that map. And you can see if that area would be on it. But yeah, so it was a combination of the actual British Mandate government finally gave money, but they were egged on by Rockefeller giving it as well. But yeah, I wonder how many other excavations at that time were impacted.
It's interesting too, because one of the things they did get in terms of help, although it wasn't actually money, was they did get the loan of some prisoners to help dig out some of the ditches. So a bit of a use of local labour force.
Indeed. So Jan Picton reminds us that it's Petrie's birthday today, apparently. Mark Sharp makes the point that malaria continued to be present in the Jordan Valley into the 50s. So there was a lot of it about, as they say. I think it's probably therefore time for us to wrap this up, to repeat what I said earlier, that Sheila Ford, our administrator, will be writing to members saying how they can obtain a copy of Eric's excellent book, Digging Up Armageddon, at a greatly reduced price. And I think it really remains for me to thank Eric once again for a superbly informative lecture. I'm going to invite all to unmute and to say thank you in the normal manner.
Thank you.
And on that, I will say thanks very much to everybody for attending, and see you next time, hopefully. Bye for now.